Welcome. I'm Nick Reveles, and this is a new season of OperaTalk. We're going to spend another season talking about the 5 operas that will be produced by San Diego Opera this coming year. The operas are Verdi's Il Trovatore, Wagner's Lohengrin, Mozart's Don Giovanni, Andre Previn's A Streetcar Named Desire, and everyone's perennial favorite, Giacomo Puccini's La Bohème. Today we'll be dealing with Trovatore, a great work with raw electric and dynamic power. It's a really exciting opera and everybody's favorite Verdi opera, I think. What was it about the character of Azucena, who is at the center of this opera, that fascinated Verdi? Like the other 4 operas in the season, she's a figure at the very center of the libretto, a female figure who we find endlessly fascinating. She's driven by 2 things: filial devotion, because she saw her mother burned at the stake as a witch 20 years before the beginning of this opera, as well as her obsession with revenge for that act, revenge over the Count de Luna, whose father killed her mother. What was it that drove Verdi to write Il Trovatore? What was going on in his life at the time, his biography, his personal life? Well, I hope that today's program will answer some of those questions about Verdi's Il Trovatore. Verdi finished the opera Rigoletto in 1851. It was extremely successful, and it dealt with a rather offbeat subject, the rape of an innocent young girl, and the father, Rigoletto, seeking revenge for that act. He also finished Stiffelio at around the same time. Stiffelio dealt with adultery, but not just your garden variety adultery, but the adultery of the wife of a Protestant minister. Now, all of these subjects were found to be rather salacious and were not thought very well of by the critics. The music, of course, was extremely popular. Everybody went to Verdi's operas. Verdi really took it on the chin from critics for these difficult subjects. At the same time, he was going through some personal turmoil. He had been living for many years with the soprano Giuseppina Straponi as his wife, but he was never interested in legitimizing that relationship through an official marriage. There are various stories as to why. One is that perhaps his first wife, who died in childbirth many years before, made him promise never to marry again. Well, we're not sure about that. But we do know that Verdi was not one who particularly cared for religious ceremonies. In fact, he considered himself an agnostic. And so he didn't want to have anything to do with a real official marriage in a church. This, of course, drove Giuseppina absolutely nuts because she, like most of the people in Italy at the time, was a staunch Catholic. Well, so was everybody else in the tiny village of Busseto where they lived. And so they decided mid-1851 to move to Paris. And it was here that Verdi discovered the relatively contemporary Spanish play by Antonio Garcia Gutierrez, El Trovador, or The Troubadour. And he decided to write an opera based on it. He approached his librettist, Salvatore Camarano, to write a libretto based on this story. What the problem was, and Camarano got ready, I mean, he started working. He got about halfway through, and then he died. Well, of course, Verdi was bereft at the loss of this friend and great poet, Camarano. But he was without an opera libretto. So he turned to another librettist who helped finish the piece. And at the same time, he seems to have gotten the idea to write an opera based on Dumas' The Lady of the Camellias. This was, of course, to become La Traviata. Now, here's what's really fascinating about this period in Verdi's life. He's writing La Traviata and Il Trovatore simultaneously. These works could not be more different, and they're both great masterworks. La Traviata is a more experimental drawing room tragedy, whereas Il Trovatore is much more traditional, writ large against this great political backdrop. Just as in the case of Rigoletto, although the piece was wildly received by the audience, the critics didn't much care for it. Well, it essentially follows the plot of Il Trovatore, which is still considered a great Spanish classic of the theater. It's set against the political background of a civil war in Spain during the 15th century between the Prince of Aragon and the Prince of Biscay. Let's talk a little bit about the story. 20 years before our story begins, the gypsy Azucena witnesses her mother burned at the stake by the Count de Luna for witchcraft. Blinded by revenge, she kidnaps the Count's young son and throws him into the smoldering embers of the fire. A few seconds later, horrified, she realizes that in her blind rage, she's thrown not the Count's young son, but her own young son into the fire. The Count de Luna's other son grows up to become Count and finds himself locked in a bitter struggle with the Prince Urgel of Biscay. Prince Urgel's most powerful warrior is Manrico, the young child whom Azucena has raised as her own. The Count de Luna also discovers that he and Manrico are in love with the same woman, Leonora, a lady-in-waiting to the Princess of Aragon. The plot of the libretto is driven by the intense hatred shared between de Luna and Manrico, the obsessive seeking for revenge by Azucena, and finally the suspense of the audience, wondering when it will finally be revealed that Manrico and the Count de Luna are actually brothers. When Verdi set out to write Il Trovatore, he insisted that the central figure of the drama was the gypsy witch Azucena. It is, after all, her and her seeking for revenge that sets the whole plot into motion. So since she's such a central character, Verdi characterizes her in a very specific way. Now, the 19th century version of the gypsy is the woman, of course, with the big earrings who dances around the campfire and the fiddlers playing wildly along as she dances. So Verdi always associates Azucena, the gypsy witch, with dance music. In fact, almost all of her music throughout significant points of the drama are written in 3/4 time, 3 beats to a measure. This example is perfect to show you that her music is often cast in the form of a kind of waltz. In her case, a very sinister waltz. That's the famous second act aria of Azucena, Stride la Vampa, in which she tells the whole story of what happened to her mother 20 years before, when her mother was burned at the stake as a witch by the older Count de Luna. She tells the story a number of times throughout the opera. This is kind of the structure of the libretto. And when she tells it again in Act 3, she describes the event in even more detail, and we get a piece of music that is actually in 6 beats to the measure, but still feels like 3. In order to add to the tragedy and the horror of the frightening image of her mother being burned at the stake, there's a twisted little rhythmic figure in the strings accompanying this aria. And off the beat, a little obsessive sigh in a solo clarinet and violin. It's the typical half-step sigh. Here is all of that accompaniment together. It creates a kind of atmosphere that's scary and suspenseful and very, very witchy, since it is accompanying Azucena. Let me add now in the piano her vocal line, which expresses all of her pain and her anger at her seeking for revenge. That little sigh is always there, reminding us that her obsession is revenge for her mother's death. There's one more opportunity for her to tell the story, and for Verdi to give her dance-like music. And it's towards the end of the opera, as she's explaining to her son Manrico, again, this whole story, her object of revenge, her need to get back at the evil Count de Luna. Again, a waltz. Azucena is never very far away from her origins in the dance. Il Trovatore has been popular with audiences ever since the first night it was performed in 1853 at the Teatro Apollo. Audiences find it an exciting and elemental, a primitive experience in a way. It's a great, exciting, and dynamic opera. But critics have always condemned this piece. From the time it was written all the way to today, there are still critics who take after it for one reason or another. Well, there are three basic criticisms. Let me go through each of them with you. First of all, the criticism by early critics that Il Trovatore killed the bel canto movement. Now, bel canto was that style followed by earlier Romantic composers like Rossini, Donizetti, and Bellini. They emphasized the beauty of the voice and long, expressive lines, particularly musical lines that heightened the sensitivity to the text. Another criticism was the fact that it was way too violent, this opera, that it was indeed a raw and crude approach musically to the story by Giuseppe Verdi, and that this darkness and this melancholy and the emphasis on violence was too much for the opera stage. The third criticism is the one that I think is still flagged around by various critics throughout the world, and that is that the plot of Il Trovatore seems unbelievable, and that it is the epitome of the silliness that opera librettos can come to. Well, each of these criticisms can be refuted. Let me take them on one at a time. First of all, the criticism that Il Trovatore signaled the end of the bel canto style. Well, that's simply not true. In my mind, Il Trovatore is really the apotheosis of the bel canto style. Yes, indeed, Verdi's music matches the darkness of the text of the story. This is the kind of darkness and raw elemental power that the musicologist Francis Toy once said that it's almost as if each of the characters in Trovatore was shot from a cannon onto the stage. It does have that quality. But there are also gorgeous moments, long, beautiful vocal lines, and above all, Verdi's music heightens the text. It is sensitive to the text. Now, the text is darker than anything that Rossini or Bellini or Donizetti could have come up with. The music matches it, and that is bel canto, ultimately the matching of music to text. The second problem, of course, was this concept of violence, of Il Trovatore being too violent for the opera stage in the middle of the 19th century, that it was too dark, that it was too melancholy. Well, compare it to the original play, Il Trovatore by Garcia Gutierrez. The play, if anything, is darker and more violent than the opera. Well, Verdi, again, matches the spirit of the original. But not just that. It's violent for a reason. It's violent because the political background, this 15th century civil war between Aragon and Biscay, was indeed violent and dark and bloody. What civil war wasn't? As for the third criticism, the unbelievability of the libretto, I don't think anybody can seriously say that this libretto is silly or unbelievable if they take the time to read it. It is convoluted. Stories about war and political aggression and civil war particularly are convoluted. The stories that come from our own civil war are difficult and sometimes impossible to follow. Unbelievable? Well, can we believe that a woman crazed by rage and by obsession for revenge would pick up a baby and throw it into a fire, only moments later to realize it was her own child? Could anybody be that unbelievable? The stories that we hear from World War II, stories we hear from contemporary Kosovo or Chechnya, I mean, all of these stories are bloody, violent, almost unbelievable, and yet they happened. They happened to Verdi as well. When he was young, an Austrian troop of soldiers came through Busseto, and his own mother had to hide him in a church tower to keep him from being killed. Unbelievable? Probably not to Verdi and not to Garcia Gutierrez. Read the libretto. It's not as silly and not as unbelievable as critics may lead you to believe. There are, of course, challenges when approaching Il Trovatore as a producer. One is the fact that there are 8 scenes, all in different locations. Some of these scenes are separated by days, even months in time. And so it's a little bit of a challenge to bring it all together and give the production some kind of unity. The other problem, of course, is casting. There are as few true Verdi singers today as there are true Wagner singers. It's very difficult to cast Il Trovatore. This is a challenge, then, looking for the 4 right singers to sing the roles of Manrico, Leonora, Azucena, and the Count de Luna. Enrico Caruso, nearly 80 years ago, said once of Il Trovatore that the real problem is to find 4 of the greatest singers in the world to sing the piece. It's literally true. One of the glories of this score is how Verdi deals with ensembles. When 2 or more characters on stage are singing simultaneously, how does a composer deal with expressing the sometimes very different emotions and feelings of each of the characters that are singing? Well, there's a perfect example of how Verdi does this in Act 1. Actually, it's the end of Act 1 of Il Trovatore, when the Count de Luna, in his rage, has discovered Manrico, his bitterest enemy, serenading the woman he lusts after, Leonora. And he realizes during this trio that Leonora loves not him, but Manrico. And so the Count de Luna begins this trio very angry, and you can hear this in the music. In fact, Verdi makes it even angrier still by placing accents where accents wouldn't normally be, making it a kind of jagged, ragged sound, a very raw sound. Here is the Count de Luna's beginning of this Act 1 trio. It's very angry music. Lots of pulsing chords underneath, De Luna, the character, the baritone who's singing this role, has a syllable almost on every single note, making it even more driving and angry. Manrico, the tenor, and Leonora, the soprano, respond with their own tune. It's a much more lyrical tune, this time accented at the beginning of each measure where you would expect the accents to be. Now notice, since those two characters are in unity with each other, they're singing the same tune. They are, after all, in love. Here's their tune. Very regular rhythmic pulse, both of them singing the same notes, meaning that they're in unity of purpose against the Count de Luna. Now the really interesting thing that happens is when all three characters are singing at the same time. The Count has his own line down in the bass. Let me play it for you. Again, very punched music, a syllable on every single note. And Manrico and Leonora are singing on top their more lyrical melody. Here's what it all sounds like together. Well, it's very easy to distinguish who's singing what in this example. And the score is filled with moments like this, where we have these marvelous ensembles, and Verdi creates very specific, characteristic music for each person singing. So you really don't need to look at the super titles to know what's going on. Just listen to the music. It's all there. Another wonderful example of this technique is a simple one in Act 2, when Manrico has a duet with his mother, Azucena. Manrico describes in a lyrical fashion how, at the end of the last act, he had a duel with the Count de Luna. He had his sword at the Count's neck, and he was ready to strike. And he heard in his head a voice saying, "Non ferir," do not strike. And so he withheld the mortal and fatal blow. Here is the tune that Manrico uses to describe this event. It's essentially lyrical. You'll have to take my word for the fact that when he gets a little closer to talking about actually striking the Count de Luna, the music becomes a little bit more exciting and intense. The important thing here is that his mother responds with a completely different tune. It's in the same key, but not at all in the same spirit. As a matter of fact, Verdi marks the entrance of Azucena as meno mosso, a little less movement. Notice that in the accompaniment of her tune, Verdi drops out every fourth note, so it becomes irregular. And over that, a kind of punched melody that is extremely different from the lyrical nature of the music of her son. Again, ensembles like this abound through Trovatore, and it's one of the glories of the score. There are some excellent classic recordings of Verdi's Il Trovatore for you to purchase and listen to so that you can really get to know the music and story before you see the opera in our house. Let's talk about some of them. Certainly one of the most important recent recordings of Trovatore was conducted by Carlo Maria Giulini. It stars Placido Domingo, Rosalind Plowright, and a wonderful performance by Brigitte Fassbinder as Azucena. Those of you who remember the great recordings of the 40s and 50s will love this reissue of Verdi's Trovatore starring Björling, Milanov, and Fedora Barbieri as the Gypsy Witch. A great bargain recording is a reissue of Trovatore starring Carlo Bergonzi, Antonietta Stella, and Fiorenza Cossotto as Azucena. One of the great Leonoras, certainly not my most favorite figure or character in the opera, but a person who has some wonderful music, was Leontine Price, who recorded the opera 2 times. First of all with Arturo Basile conducting, Richard Tucker as the Manrico, Leonard Warren as De Luna, and Rosalind Elias as Azucena. And then again with Zubin Mehta conducting, Placido Domingo as Manrico, Cheryl Milnes in the role of Count de Luna, and Fiorenza Cossotto in the pivotal role of the Gypsy Witch. All of these recordings have been well reviewed by critics, and I recommend each and every one of them. Il Trovatore is not a revolutionary piece of music theater. It's not an experiment, rather like Rigoletto and La Traviata were, both operas written during the same period. But it is exciting from the very first moment to the last, dynamic and electric. Audiences are always swept away by it, and I know I'm looking forward to being swept away too. This is Nick Reveles. I'll see you at the opera.